Today we're looking once again at the topic of fraud, and in particular romance and relationship fraud. And to do this, we're here at Humberside Police with Ben. Ben, this type of fraud, is it relatively new?
I suppose it is relatively new. We've seen it over the last few years. If I could explain what we mean by romance fraud or relationship fraud. So generally it takes place online. Someone will be either on a traditional dating site or on a social media site, and they'll get into a conversation which may then form into a relationship with an individual. It will take place mainly online. It may take place on something like WhatsApp. They move to WhatsApp chatting, and then after a period of time there'll be some sort of request for money from the suspect to the victim. Most people have probably seen something like the Tinder swindler, which sort of is a good example of what a romance fraud is. And we can see people talking to someone who they think they're in a relationship. It can be for a number of years. This takes place, and it has a massive psychological impact on the victim. I'm sure you can imagine if you've been in a relationship with someone, and potentially if you've given that individual money. A lot of people we've seen giving away all their life savings. If you suddenly find out that that person who you thought you were in love with, actually everything you think about that is a load of lies, and they've taken all your life savings, it can have a huge impact on you.
So how on earth in this modern world then do we actually sort out the good from the bad?
That's a good question. So I suppose one thing, if you lived your life almost by, if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. You can probably protect yourself from most things. And also, if you sort of challenge everything and ask yourself questions, if this person, or if we go on to talk about maybe other types of frauds, if that's genuine, and ask yourself questions and put things in place, then you can protect yourself. So if we're talking about, in this particular instance, romance fraud, if there's a profile picture, you can put that into websites on Google, something like TinEye, and that will show you where that image has come from. Now, if that's like you or I's profile picture, I don't know if you've got an online presence, that might take you to your Facebook page, and you can see, then look at that individual. What we see with romance fraudsters, they will take the profile picture of, we've seen US Forces individuals, so it may take you to that place on the internet and show you where that photo. So straight away that will flag up about that individual. It's a red flag, if you want, for a better phrase.
Is there a particular age group that's more vulnerable than another? I mean, often when people are coming out of a relationship, a long-term relationship, and maybe they're not quite as up on all these fantastic sites that you can go to and whatever. I mean, it really is. It's a minefield, isn't it?
I suppose there's no specific age group. It's just you can be vulnerable to this type of offence for a number of different reasons. You know, you've just mentioned there, if you're not particularly tech savvy, or you've not been on dating websites before and you're trying this for the first time, then you might be vulnerable because of that, because you're not sure how those interactions go on. It may be you're vulnerable because you have just come out of a relationship and you're sort of emotionally vulnerable to someone who then comes along and tells you everything you want to hear about yourself, tells you they're in love with you, what an amazing person they are. Because to explain how they work in some instances. So in the police, when we're trying to find out about someone, we'll look on our intelligence systems and build up a profile. The fraudster will do exactly the same thing. So if they can find your Facebook profile, Instagram profile, they can then turn themselves into the perfect partner. So if you like, for example, I don't know, say golf, maybe cooking, they may then turn themselves in and start explaining themselves of loving cooking. They may talk about golf or something like that, so they then become that perfect partner.
So essentially they're not obviously real relationships, are they? And how is it a crime? Maybe you could explain that to me, because if you are talking with somebody and say you do hand over your life savings to somebody, or you sign over your house and all this kind of thing, and you're doing it for all the right reasons that you believe, is that a crime? You know, how on earth do you prosecute against something like that when they could presumably turn around and just say, well, this is just a relationship that hasn't worked out?
So if I take that in a couple of points there, I'll work from the back forward. It's really difficult to prosecute. Now explain why. Because a lot of these people aren't actually who they're claiming to be. So that's where the criminal side comes into it. So if I'm the fraudster, romance fraudster, for example, I look online, I pick someone else's profile picture, I use that, and I portray myself as a member of the US forces working in Syria. I've got a young family in America. My wife's recently died, so I'm widowed. And then I will create fictitious events within my life where I require money. So I'm telling lies to obtain money from my partner. That's how it becomes a criminal offence.
Right. So, in a way, though, I mean, this is just me maybe overthinking this a little bit. If I didn't create a false identity, and that was just me, and I did everything except create the false identity, and then people handed over money, handed over belongings and whatever, would that be an offence then?
If we're just in a normal relationship and you haven't told lies about why you want the money, and then that person freely gives you the money, then that wouldn't be an offence. This specific crime type is a very specific MO, for want of a better phrase, so mode that these people operate in, and that they operate in the online environment, that people do not exist in who they're portraying themselves to be. They are a lot of times organised crime groups within West Africa, and they will, at the same time that they're talking to our victim, they'll also be talking to a number of other victims as well, probably with the same personality. During the course of that relationship, they may manipulate the victim in various other ways. So what we might see is the suspect will say he's sending the victim a present. She will then get an email from a shipping company asking for them to pay the taxes. She may then get, I'm saying she just generically, male as well, he may then get an email from the tax office saying that they need to pay taxes on it. So you can see everything's just lies originating from one person.
Right. And is this online fraud, is it likely to be from outside of the UK then? Is that maybe one of the alarm bells that might ring if you suddenly start communicating with somebody from that part of the world or another part of the world?
So 70% of fraud originates from abroad anyway. In this particular crime type, you might not realise you're talking with someone abroad. They may claim they're someone else. It is one of the tactics they use because they're in a specific part of the world. They will say, for example, they're US forces in Syria where there's a time difference, and they will use that to manipulate why they can't talk to you, or why they can't maybe do a FaceTime because they're in a war zone, things like that. It should be a red flag straight away, because if someone is in the US forces, why aren't they on a US dating site? Why are they on a UK dating site? That should be a red flag straight away.
Right. So what are these red flags? And you've mentioned that obviously one of the biggest ones, one of the biggest proportions. Are there any other obvious red flags that you might, if you're online and you're pursuing romance, and you want to meet this person and you want to get close to somebody, what are the other red flags you should look out for?
Well, I suppose you've just mentioned one there. If you are, and that person is not in the UK, that's a red flag straight away. If the person can't actually meet you in person, that's a flag. If they won't do a video call with you, then that's a red flag. Because if we're on a website and we're in an ordinary relationship situation, we'd be having telephone calls, text messages, maybe FaceTime, meeting up with the individual. That's a normal relationship progressing. If the person can't do any of those things, then those are red flags. The big ones are if within a matter of weeks and you never met this person, they're saying they love you, things like that, real strong emotions. If they make any requests for money, then that's straight away. One thing you can do, it's not necessarily a red flag, is look at the language they're using as well. If they're from outside of the UK, English may not be their first language, so they'll be using a translation tool. So how does it actually read? Is it how you'd expect someone who can speak English to be speaking to you?
Right. So how do you know then that you're a subject of fraud? So at what point do you suddenly say you go so far down this road and you ignore some of these red flags, and then you've given some money away? At what point do you say, hang on a minute, this is potential crime, I need to report it? How do you know when to report it?
I suppose it's when it's that realisation that all the red flags have added up to, you get that feeling that the person doesn't exist. If there's if they're making excuses why they can't meet you, then obviously that should be a red flag. If they're making constant requests for your money, that's a red flag. If they are trying to keep your relationship secret away from other people, that's a red flag, and you should start to realise that you're a victim of romance fraud.
Right. So at that point then, is that a crime? Or should you be saying, well, I'll just stop communicating with that person and move on? Should it be reported?
It should be reported, absolutely, because what we need is people to report it so that we can give them the support they may need to get back on their feet, so they can understand that there's nothing wrong with being a victim of romance fraud. These are professional criminals. So if they report it, we can give them that support. And more importantly, we can take some of the information they've got about how they've met this person, who they are, if they've communicated by email. We can take that information, feed it into our system, for want of a better phrase, and try and take steps to take that individual down as a fraudster.
Right. Is there nothing that the internet companies should be doing? The internet providers can or should be doing? Is there active things happening behind the scenes that maybe we're not aware of to try and filter some of this out the system?
So social media platforms, dating platforms, they do within their algorithms have things that look to identify false profiles and take them down. It's very difficult because as much as you can take one down, they can come straight back up again. But they do work to try and weed these people out.
And how big a problem is it? Have you any idea how many in our part of the world, how many people are the victim of this romance fraud?
So I think roughly per year reported, we get somewhere between 60 and 80 people report that they're victims of romance fraud. To put that into some sort of context, whilst I've been in this role for 4.5, nearly 5 years, I know of 4 victims over that period who between them have lost £1 million. So fraud's a massively underreported offence, and you can imagine, especially this offence, would you want to talk to a police officer about how a criminal has got you to give away your life savings? Imagine, it's quite embarrassing. So it's really underreported. So it's a big problem.
And I guess also the fact that you're going to go through a bit of a review, aren't you? If you decide, right, I'm not going to communicate anymore, the fact that you're giving away this amount of money, and then you may maybe go to the police and say, actually, I think I might be a victim of romance fraud. I suppose there's a lot of pressure on is it worth going through all the stress of reporting it?
Yeah, I think there's lots of pressures on that individual at that moment in time, whether they actually want to report it to the police. There's got to be embarrassment with some people. And I suppose if we were if I could talk to someone now who was sat opposite me, I'd say, don't be embarrassed. Okay, there's nothing to be embarrassed about, but the very fact that you're going to have to sit in front of someone and explain everything, because in hindsight, with a lot of things we do in our life, we could say, I'd never do that. And I'm sure a lot of people, if they look down in hindsight in these situations, would say, I wouldn't do that. But you can't look at it in that way. You have to look at it as it is like being in a relationship, that people will manipulate vulnerabilities in individual. And when I mean vulnerabilities, we're all vulnerable when we get into a new relationship. They just take advantage of that situation.
So maybe, do you have potentially 3 tips you can give us, anybody listening to this right now, if they're maybe listening thinking, well, actually, I'm online talking to somebody at the moment. Am I a victim of romance fraud? Is there anything that you would immediately shout out to us and say, this is what you need to look out for?
I suppose one of the main things is if the person is saying they are abroad. That's got to be a big flag, because, as I've said before, why are they on a UK dating site? If the person makes any requests for money from you, that should be a red flag straight away. And a third one, also, if the person asks you to receive any money on their behalf and move it on. That should be a real red flag as well, because when I mentioned they'll be talking to more than one individual, what they might actually look to do is almost money laundering the proceeds through different people's accounts. So that would be a real red flag as well.
Ben, great. Thank you very much indeed. You're going to have something to think about.